Strong drinks are raging. Wine is a marker. The teachers teach the lies. The preachers establish it high. Babylon makes the wine to blow the people's mind. The teachers teach the lies. The preachers establish it high. Babylon makes the wine to blow the people's mind. Jaja made the herb to soothe the people's mind. Babylon ban it and call it a crime. They legalize the wrong and ban the true. The parson button his collar behind his back, hiding his face from the fact. Confusion of the land, judgment is at hand. The teachers teach the lies. The preachers establish it high. Babylon makes the wine to blow the people's mind. When you read the morning paper, murder is the headline news. Confusion on the land, judgment is at hand. Yes, it's true, everyone knows it's true. Yes, it's true. The teachers teach the lies. The preachers establish it high. Babylon makes the wine to blow the people's mind. The teacher teach the lies. The preacher establish it high. Babylon makes the wine to blow the people's mind. Yes, it's true, true, true.
One of the most powerful proofs for the fabrication of the character called Jesus Christ is to be found in plain sight in every copy of the New Testament. If ever there was an elephant in the room, this is it. And what is it that I'm talking about? Well, actually, I'm referring to the Gospel of John, otherwise known as the Fourth Gospel. It's commonly called the Fourth Gospel today because that naive belief that it was written by an illiterate Aramaic-speaking son of Zebedee called John the Apostle is patently absurd. Whatever else it may be, John's Gospel most certainly is not the memoirs of an old fisherman writing theology in polished Greek at his retirement home and using Mark as a crib sheet. John's Gospel is notoriously anti-Jewish, referring constantly to the Jews in opposition to the good guys, the followers of Jesus, supposedly Jews themselves. The authors of this Gospel construct whole speeches, thousands of words long, put into the mouth of a Jesus who in the other Gospels only ever speaks in pithy sound bites or pre-packed parables. Nor does John's Jesus have much concern for the poor and needy, but endlessly espouses his own divinity, glory and importance. What we have in John's Gospel is Jesus the God, a divinity just visiting planet Earth and making known that only he is to be worshipped and adored. It is a formulation put together by unknown apostate Jews and Judaized pagans in the 2nd century, at a time when there was no longer the expectation of an imminent judgment day. Theirs is a God for the long haul, designed to compete with and supplant the competition, whether it came from rabbinic Judaism, baptizers, Gnostics, or the priests of Dionysus or Asclepius. In their Gospel of John, the authors take shots at all of these. Christians have always known that there were difficulties with the so-called Gospel of John, that it told a story often at odds with the 3 other Gospels, that it omitted many key episodes found in the Synoptic Gospels, including all those that named the Apostle John himself. But on the other hand, it introduced tales, miracles and characters quite unknown to the other evangelists, and which, if true, should have been mentioned by them. But over the centuries, Christians have found ways to sidestep the problems. That's why today they find it more convenient to jettison the purported author of the Gospel rather than the Gospel itself. Because, for better or worse, it's John's Gospel that defines many fundamental Christian beliefs, like the divinity of Christ, the immortality of the soul, or salvation by faith. Typically, Christian writers describe the 4th Gospel not as another biography of Jesus, but as a reflection on the meaning of Jesus. And yet, for all of its grand and florid interpretations of the substance and meaning of Jesus, all those endless metaphors about bread from heaven, the living water, the true vine, the shepherd and his sheep, etc., John's Gospel nonetheless does present another retelling of the story of Jesus. And it's here that we'll begin, because that rewritten core story explains the overblown theological superstructure that swamps this Gospel. The first striking revision in the 4th Gospel is that the ministry of Jesus has ballooned out from 1 year to 3. The writers make reference not just to 1 but to 3 distinct Passover festivals. Now, is this just a different tradition that some early Christians held to a tradition of a 3-year ministry and others to a 1-year ministry? Can anyone honestly maintain that whole dialogues could be remembered word for word for many decades, and yet believers have no common agreement whether these words were said during 1 year or during 3 years?
Lucifer, son of the morning, I'm gonna chase you out of earth. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase Satan out of earth. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase the devil out of earth. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. Satan is a evilous man, but him can't choke sit on I man. So when I check him, my lass in hand, and if him slip, I gone with him hand. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase Satan out of earth. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase the devil out of earth. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. Oh yeah. Him have to drop him fork and run. Him can't stand up to judge a son. Him have to left ya with him gun. Dig off with him bomb. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase Satan out of earth. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase the devil out of earth. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. Satan is a evilous man, but him can't choke sit on I man. So when I check him, I lass in hand, and if him slip, I gone with him hand. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase Satan out of earth. I'm gonna put on an iron shirt and chase the devil out of earth. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race. I'm gonna send him to outer space to find another race.
hard to imagine that Hollywood hasn't jumped all over this. You would think it would be box office gold because it's part Spartacus and part Braveheart and part Amistad and part Glory with a little bit of Dances with Wolves thrown in. A story decades long of oppression and freedom fighting. I don't understand why there hasn't been more attention to John Horse and the Black Seminoles, but hopefully we can correct this. John Horse and the Black Seminoles deserve to be remembered for a number of reasons. They created the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway slaves. They led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They secured the only emancipation of rebellious slaves prior to the U.S. Civil War, and they formed the largest mass exodus of slaves across the United States, moving from the Florida Everglades through Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, eventually locating in Mexico, where they secured title to their own land. It's a remarkable story. It's overlooked not just by filmmakers, it's not well known in popular culture, and in fact it's been overlooked by historians of slavery, if you can believe it. In the early 18th century, two groups in particular fled the colonial South into Spanish Florida, into the Everglades. One of these groups were Seminoles, who were migrating from the various colonies, just trying to avoid white encroachment, basically, trying to move someplace that white colonists weren't. And the other group was runaway slaves, people who were fleeing and trying to create a free life for themselves. Both were welcome in Florida, and in fact, the Spanish crown offered runaway slaves their freedom if they would defend the land for the crown, for the Spanish. So a mixed society emerged in the Everglades of intermarriage, family intermingling between these runaway slaves and the Seminoles. And in fact, the first legally sanctioned black free town in the North American continent was in the Spanish Florida Everglades. After the American Revolution, people living in the southern states didn't really like living that close to a large armed population of former slaves, particularly when they were in league with the local Native American nation, the large armed group of free Seminoles. And they knew that their own slaves felt free to run away and be harbored by this group. They knew that they were welcomed. And so from George Washington's administration on, there was questions of what do we do about the problem of the Florida Everglades. In 1818, this was James Monroe's administration, General Andrew Jackson actually moved into Florida, invaded it, not authorized to do so. He was actually pursuing justice against those who'd attacked Fort Scott in Georgia, but he did it anyway. He went into Florida and claimed it for the United States. When he seized the peninsula, he took the opportunity to execute some of the people who opposed him and also to clean out some of the areas of former slaves and Seminoles because he felt that this would make it better for annexation. The United States then soon actually bought Florida from the Spanish. When Jackson became president, he decided to make sure that the black Seminole communities were moved out by force. So he pursued this in his policy, his larger policy of Indian removal. This led to the Second Seminole War, which was 1835 to 1842, and became the largest and costliest of the so-called Indian Wars. Because the two communities were tied together, that is, the former slaves and the Seminoles, when the Seminoles were attacked in the Seminole War, this led to an uprising of the former slaves. In April of 1836, Black Seminoles and their Indian allies moved together to create what was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. This wasn't just a matter of runaway slaves. More than 385 plantation slaves ran away from their masters and joined the Black Seminoles, essentially in laying waste to the Florida sugar mills, which were some of the most valuable areas, plantations in the whole continent. One Seminole leader at the time was the leader Osceola, who is justly remembered by history. Another leader who rose up at this time was John Horse, who was ethnically a Black Seminole, and who would ultimately lead his people on a long and trying exodus for their freedom. In 1838, John Horse and the Black Seminoles agreed to stop fighting the U.S. government in exchange for moving to what was then considered to be Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma, and for legal recognition of their freedom. So despite the fact many of them were runaway slaves, they would have the opportunity to start over again as free individuals. Once they moved from the Everglades to Indian Territory, however, they found that their freedom was under attack, both by whites and by other Native Americans. In 1848, a decade after they had made the agreement with the U.S. government, the U.S. Attorney General announced that the government never had the authority, the power to recognize their freedom. And in fact, they were still, those who had been slaves, still enslaved. This was like opening season on them, basically declaring that they were there for the picking. And so they did the only thing they could do. They fled once again. Without security in Indian Territory, Horse and his Seminole ally Coacuchi promptly went to Mexico, where slavery was already illegal and had been for a couple of decades. There, Horse became famous as a general in the Mexican army, and his people found a way to make a life. Once they relocated to Mexico, things changed. When slave catchers from the Republic of Texas went over the border to try to find the runaway slaves, now free men, they met resistance not only from the Black Seminoles, but also from the Mexicans and the Mexican army itself. Eventually, the Black Seminoles, led by Horse, gained legally recognized Mexican land, nacimiento. Why isn't this recognized today? Well, for one thing, historians tend to be historians of Native American history or historians of slavery, but there's not many that move among these subjects. And it's a bit confusing because you have both the issue of runaway slaves and the issue of Native Americans kind of blended together, so it seems to fall through the cracks. Tradition is that Nat Turner's rebellion is the big turning point in the history of slavery and slave revolt. But that happened before the rebellion of the Black Seminoles, so it doesn't really fit the traditional trajectory. And perhaps most importantly, it really represents a blemish on U.S. history, not only because of the poor treatment of Native America as represented by the Seminole War, not only the poor treatment of African Americans through the device of slavery, but also because this group really did manage to negotiate a separate peace with the U.S. government, and 10 years later the government turned their backs on them. So it's, in multiple ways, a difficult story for people of the United States to tell. But it's worth remembering that a community of freedom fighters trekked from Florida to Oklahoma to Mexico and found, ultimately, peace and freedom and prosperity in lives that they could direct as their own.
Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, 'cause they know not what they have done. Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our culture. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our position. But forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. But protect those, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Protect those, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. They have robbed those, they have robbed those, they have robbed those of our culture. They have robbed those, they have robbed those, they have robbed those of our position. But forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Protect those, Jaja, oh protect those in every way. Oh, protect those, Jaja, oh protect those in every way. Oh, protect those, Rasta, oh protect those in every way. Protect those, Jaja, oh protect those along the way. Protect those, Jaja, oh protect those, 'cause they know not what they are doing. Protect those, Jaja, oh protect those, 'cause they know not what